Yeah, thanks everyone for joining in the middle of an English heat wave. I thought the best way for me to sort of showcase a particular design argument would be to continue in the train of yesterday's lecture. You remember I talked about two big discoveries that have, as I put it in the subtitle of my book, revealed the mind behind the universe. We talked about developments in cosmology, developments in physics. There are design arguments based in physics. Yesterday's discussion of fine-tuning is one of those. But the third big discovery that I highlighted in my book was a discovery, or is a discovery, in biology. And so I thought I'd talk about that and talk about how my engagement with that evidence led to the development with colleagues of a very specific design argument. And then at the very end, if we have a little bit of time, or if not in the discussion, we can talk about how design arguments can be useful in apologetics and evangelism. So we talked about two key discoveries yesterday: that the material universe had a beginning, that the universe has been fine-tuned for life from the very beginning of the universe. And then today I want to talk about a third big discovery, which is the discovery that living cells, even the simplest living cells, contain information in a digital form, or in a more technical definition, they have specified information, and we'll get into that. So the big discovery that opens this up starts in the 1950s, 1953, right here in Cambridge. Watson and Crick published a model elucidating the structure of the DNA molecule. 5 years later, in 1958, possibly an even more significant discovery. It's first proposed as a kind of conjecture by Francis Crick. It's called the sequence hypothesis. And what Crick realizes is that the chemical subunits along the spine of the DNA molecule are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text, or like digital characters in a section of machine code. George Gamow, a physicist at the time, as he was studying the DNA, realized that the A's, C's, G's, and T's, the subunits along the interior of the molecule, functioned like a digital bit string. And so many scientists have said that DNA contains information in a digital form. Richard Dawkins has highlighted this, saying that the machine code of the genes is uncannily computer-like. Apart from differences in jargon, the pages of molecular biology journals might be interchanged with those of computer engineering journals. So if DNA contains digital information and it's coding for something, what is it coding for? What's that information doing? Well, the great discoveries of that period of the molecular biological revolution, including some of Fred Sanger, for whom the institute where Zachary is working is named, was that the DNA is coding for the building of proteins. And the digital characters in the DNA end up directing the arrangement of the subunits of protein molecules, where proteins you can think of as the kind of the toolbox of the cell. They do all the most important jobs. They catalyze reactions at super fast rates. They build molecular machines. They help process the information on DNA. And they do that in virtue of having very specific three-dimensional shapes. And they acquire those shapes if, science made stupid here, got a little visual aid, if the amino acid, I'm going to represent the amino acid subunits of a protein with these little snap lock beads. If these guys are arranged properly in the correct sequence, the chain will fold and adopt a very specific shape. And if it's a shape that will perform a function, voila, you've got a functional protein. So what you've got is you've got very specific arrangements of A's, C's, G's, and T's on the DNA that translate into very specific arrangements of amino acids. And if those arrangements are right, then you get a functional outcome, a protein that will do a job in the cell. So the information in DNA is of a very specific kind. If there are any engineers in the room, you might know about Shannon information, or the sometimes called information carrying capacity. That's a measure of the improbability of a sequence across a communication channel. But it may or may not, a sequence with lots of Shannon information may or may not have any function. It may not perform a function. What we have in DNA is different. It's information that's very precisely sequenced to perform a function, in particular, the coding for the production of a protein. So we have inside the cell, this is the big discovery, we have the discovery of functional information or specified information. So we can actually have a little slide here that will show the contrast. The top sequence is a merely improbable sequence that might have a measure of Shannon information, but the bottom sequence is one that contains specified information where the arrangement of the characters is precise in order to perform a function, in this case a communication function in English. So this is the big important discovery, and it's a discovery that has very big implications for the origin of life. My PhD supervisor here had a quote that I've often cited. She said that at the heart of the problem of the origin of life lies a fundamental question. What exactly is it that we're trying to explain the origin of? After the 1950s and 60s and 70s, this period called the molecular biological revolution, scientists realized that we were not dealing with a simple homogeneous globule of plasm, as one of Darwin's colleagues described the cell in the 1860s, but we were rather dealing with an information storage, transmission, and processing system in every single cell in every single organism on Earth. So if you want to explain the origin of the first life, at the very least, you've got to explain where that information and where that information processing system came from. It's a whole new day in biology, post Watson and Crick and Sanger and the others in the Max Perutz, the whole gang, many of whom are right here in Cambridge. And so after the molecular biological revolution, people working on the origin of life had to reset what the goalposts were, what they were trying to explain. And one scientist put it this way. He said, the problem of the origin of life is clearly, basically equivalent to the problem of the origin of information. And again, we're talking about information in a digital form, essentially, which is functionally specified. Now, I first encountered this problem, the problem of the origin of life, at a conference way back early in my career, and with a scientist named Charles Thaxton, who had just written with two other colleagues an important book called The Mystery of Life's Origin. And Thaxton was critiquing these theories of chemical evolution, how you get from the chemicals in the supposed prebiotic soup before life arose, and how those chemicals arranged themselves into the first cell. And by the mid-'80s, theories of that sort had reached a kind of impasse. None of them were working, and everyone knew, and the big problem was this newly revealed complexity on the interior of the cell, an informational complexity, and therefore the origin of information itself. And Thaxton and his colleagues provided a very extensive critique that was very well received by many people working in the field of evolutionary abiogenesis or chemical evolutionary theory. But they went further than that and suggested that the information-bearing properties of DNA might provide the basis for a reformulation of the classical design argument. Now, I encountered that, and I thought it was a pretty interesting and provocative conjecture. But it was especially significant because by this time it was pretty much conventional wisdom, any time after Darwin, that biological design arguments had been refuted by Darwin. This is a fairly famous evolutionary biologist, Francisco Ayala. He said it was Darwin's great achievement to show that the appearance of design in living beings can be explained as a result of a natural process, natural selection, without any need to resort to a creator or external agent. So you have these guys, Thaxton, Bradley, and Olson, they come along and they say, look, the information in DNA suggests the activity of a mind. Information is a mind product. And we've been told there's no evidence of the activity of a mind in biology for over 100 years. Now, why could this idea get traction? Well, part of the reason is that Darwin attempted to explain the appearance of design once life had begun. He was explaining, he argued, all the appearances of design that had resulted after the beginning of life. He did not attempt to explain the origin of life itself. And these scientists were saying at the point of the origin of life, at the point of the very first cell, the thing that Darwin never explained, we have massive evidence of design or appearances of design that certainly have not been explained away by any undirected mechanism. So the origin of life problem, became very important, and it certainly fascinated me. Again, Dawkins says that the machine code of the gene is uncannily computer-like, but the machine code of the genes is present in the very simplest cell. So we've got a striking appearance of design that neither Darwinism nor chemical evolutionary theory has explained. So I got intrigued with that. I ended up coming here. I ended up doing my PhD in the Philosophy of Science department, History and Philosophy of Science department, on origin of life biology. I did an interdisciplinary thesis. And when I got here, I had a kind of burning question in my mind, which was, could this design hypothesis that Thaxton and his colleagues were floating, could it be made into a rigorous scientific argument? There was an intuitive connection. Yeah, right, information seems to point to a mind, but could that be cashed out as a rigorous scientific argument? And ironically, one of the people that helped me most with this was another Charles, and that was Charles Darwin. And what Darwin noted was that in defending his own theory is that when people are reasoning historically, when they're doing historical science, when they're trying to determine what might have caused things to happen in the remote past, they use a distinctive method of reasoning that has a name. It's called inference to the best explanation, or sometimes called multiple competing hypotheses. The idea is that if there's a specific historical event and you want to explain it, you want to posit all the different things that might explain it, and then you want to choose that thing which, if true, would best explain it. Except one thing. What does it mean to be a best explanation? How do we decide what makes something best? And as I was noodling on this here during my own PhD work, an American professor came to candidate in the History and Philosophy of Science department, named Peter Lipton, and he had just written an important book called Inference to the Best Explanation. And Lipton argued that the criterion that we want to look at, the most important criterion of a best explanation, is what he called causal adequacy. That good theories posit a cause which is known to produce the effect in question. And so when we think of inferring to the best explanation, we want to look at what causes might be possible, and then which ones are known to have the powers to produce the thing you're trying to explain. So I ended up applying this method of reasoning eventually to produce, 19 years after my PhD, it took me a while, a book, a big fat one called Signature Cell. And in the book I did two things, both of which using this method of inference to the best explanation to make a positive design argument. The first thing I did is I evaluated the competing causal explanations for the origin of information. And I found that leading molecular biologists and other scientists identified three general types of naturalistic explanations. Those that are based on chance, those that are based on law-like necessity, and those that are based on the combination of the two. And so one of the things I did in my work and also in my PhD is look at these different classes and types of explanations. That each one of these different types of naturalistic explanations were inadequate, were causally inadequate. They did not provide an adequate cause to explain the origin of information. And it wasn't just me saying this. This was what was coming out of the literature, that each of these approaches was failing. And what I found specifically is that theories of chemical evolution, depending on regardless of which approach they took, chance, necessity, or the combination of the two, either failed to explain the origin of biological information and acknowledged that failure, or they presupposed unexplained sources of information, begging the ultimate question, or three, they claimed progress as the result of what are called simulation experiments, but that the progress or the success of those experiments was only possible because investigators were interfering with the chemical system and imparting information themselves, thus actually modeling a form of intelligent design. So the naturalistic approach to the origin of information had reached a kind of impasse. And again, it's not just me saying this. There's a wonderful little clip online of Richard Dawkins being interviewed by Ben Stein about the problem of the origin of life. And Dawkins effectively admits, no one knows, that we're stymied by this from a naturalistic point of view. But the other thing that I've done in my work, and especially in Signature in the Cell, is I've made a case for the legitimacy of a radical alternative view, namely the idea of intelligent design. And I did that based on the method of reasoning that Darwin himself advanced in The Origin of Species, a method that he developed, based on his interactions with one of his mentors, Charles Lyell, the great geologist. And I had an aha moment when I was working on this, reading the title page of Lyell's book, Principles of Geology. He said, Principles of Geology being an attempt to explain the former changes of the Earth's surface, an event in the past, by reference to thunderbolt, causes now in operation. What do we look for in a best explanation? Causes which are known to produce the effect in question. So I asked myself a question. What is the cause now in operation that produces digital information, that produces code? I ask you. What is the cause now in operation that produces code? If we use this method of reasoning, the standard method of historical scientific reasoning, it's legitimate to posit whatever cause we know is capable of producing the effect we're trying to explain, or the event that we're trying to explain. This is another way of talking about Lyell's famous principle of uniformitarianism, that the present is the key to the past, meaning our present knowledge of cause and effect should guide how we reconstruct what happened in the past. So what do we know in the present about what it takes to generate information? As I was thinking on that, I came across the writings of an early information scientist who was applying information theoretic concepts to molecular biology. And on page 16 of a little book he wrote, another thunderbolt. He says, the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity. Again, what we know from the cause and effect structure of the world, what we see around us happening all the time, habitually, over and over again, our uniform and repeated experience is that it takes a mind to generate information, especially the digital specified kind that we've been talking about. Our local hero in the Seattle area, Bill Gates from Washington State, he says, DNA is like a computer program, but much more advanced than any we've ever created. Same concept as Dawkins. Well, what do we know about what it takes to generate a computer program? It's the mind, intelligence. In fact, whenever we see information and we trace it back to its source, whether we're talking about a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book or information embedded in a radio signal or a section of code in software, we always come to a mind, not a material process. And so there's positive warrant. There is evidence for the causal adequacy of mind as an entity which can generate information. And therefore, if we apply the method of inference to the best explanation, we have a very strong warrant for inferring a mind, because the method says we should infer that entity which, if true or actual, would explain the effect in question. Mind is just such an entity. Intelligence is just such an entity. So what I did in Signature in the Cell then is develop a case for intelligent design, a design argument using this method of multiple competing hypotheses or inference to the best explanation by looking at all the different competing causal explanations that have been proposed and then electing or affirming that one which is known to have the powers to produce the effect in question, namely, again, specified information. Now, I haven't gone through my critique of the theories based on chance, necessity, the combination of the two. I had a very enlightened editor at Harper One who allowed the book to go long because he said, if you're going to do inference to the best explanation, you got to look at all the competing hypotheses and explanations. I'm not assuming you all have time to read this, but I do have an article-length treatment of the book. I've left some out here for the taking that I did for an academic ministry called Ratio Christi in the United States, and it gives a my critique of the theories based on chance, those based on necessity, those based on the combination of the two. Okay, so that's the structure of the argument. Now, the only reason that the main objection I've had to the argument is it's not saying intelligence, mind, conscious activity is not sufficient to produce information. It's not that, your critique of these theories is inaccurate. No, other people agree with those critiques. The main critique I've had is that, you can't talk about intelligent design. That's not part of science. It's based on a principle called methodological naturalism that says if you're going to be a scientist, you've got to limit yourself to materialistic explanations. We challenge that, saying that good science should follow the evidence wherever it leads. You shouldn't have a pre-specified set of principles that precludes consideration of certain hypotheses. But even if you want to say, okay, it's not scientific, what if it's philosophical or metaphysical? What if it's just the best explanation? We don't care what we call it. In a sense, it doesn't matter whether it's scientific or a metaphysical hypothesis. The question is, what is the best explanation? And if we're talking about design arguments, our case is that intelligent design provides the best explanation, the most causally adequate explanation, and just precluding it from consideration is not an argument. That's putting your head in the sand. Okay, that's the argument in my book. Now, Tim has asked us just to talk a little bit about how these kinds of arguments, and Zachary's going to present a different one, can be beneficial in apologetics and evangelism. I think the first thing I want to say is these arguments that are framed as inferences to the best explanation have a number of advantages. First of all, they avoid the God of the gaps fallacy. In other words, they're not arguing based on what we don't know. They're based on what we do know about the inner workings of the cell and the information-bearing properties of DNA, my argument in particular, but also based on what we know about the cause and effect structure of the world. They're based on positive knowledge, not a gap in our knowledge. Now, many people have presented our argument or critiqued it as if it were an argument from ignorance or a God of the gap argument. Michael Shermer, with whom I've debated many times, makes the same objection every time, and every time I have the same response, and we go round and round and round. He says, this is the way and this is a straw man. He says, intelligent design argues that life is too specifically complex structures with specific functions like DNA, and irreducibly complex to have evolved by natural forces. And therefore, life must have been created by an intelligent designer. That's not our argument. Representing that symbolically, what Shermer is saying is that we argue thusly. Natural processes are insufficient to produce the effect in question, that being the information-bearing properties of DNA, therefore intelligent design. That's not how we argue. He's missing a premise. Natural processes, chance, necessity, the combination of the two, are insufficient to produce the effect in question. But we do know of a kind of cause that is sufficient to produce the effect in question, and that is a mind, or an intelligence, or conscious agency. And therefore, when we consider all the possible causal hypotheses, intelligent design is the best of those on offer. So we have an inference to the best explanation, not an argument from ignorance or a God of the argument. If see the sense of this, imagine if you go to the British Museum, you walk in, and you read all about how they figured out that the Rosetta Stone was 3 different languages and there were scribes. And so the archaeologists there have clearly made an inference to an intelligence. You wouldn't say, well, gosh, they made a scribe of the gaps argument there. No, they used good reasoning based on what we know about the cause and effect structure of the world. The kind of effect that they were seeing on that rock is one that is only known to be produced by intelligent agents. Another advantage of this type of argument, and this relates directly to the idea, the question of apologetics, is that these types of arguments respect the, thank you, Tim, yeah, got it. They respect the boundary that St. Paul puts on natural theology. If you remember the passage in Romans 1, he says that from the things that are made, the unseen qualities of the Creator are clearly manifest, his power and divine wisdom. I'm rearranging all the clauses, but he says, look, we can know God's power, we can know his wisdom from the things that are made. But what he doesn't say is we can infer the gospel from the revelation in nature. There's a limited remit for these types of arguments. They can provide evidence for an intelligent agent who is powerful and wise, but you can't go much beyond that, okay? But nevertheless, having made that kind of an inference, justified that inference with a good argument, you now have a nice foundation upon which you can build other apologetic arguments. There's a kind of step-by-step approach you can take. So I've got a little diagram here showing that accepted scientific facts point to intelligent design because of its superior explanatory power. That can become a scientific research program leading to other predictions. But you can also, if you add the evidence from biology to the evidence that we looked at from cosmology yesterday, and we think about, well, which worldview best explains the Big Bang and the cosmic fine-tuning, I've argued that, well, theism and deism do a pretty good job of that. Materialism and pantheism don't, because neither of them affirm the existence of an entity independent from the universe that could act as a cause of the entire universe or its fine-tuned structure. So if you start with looking at the cosmological evidence, you can get to theism or deism using inference to the best explanation, where we're evaluating competing metaphysical or worldview hypotheses. But then we bring in the evidence of design down the timeline, long after the beginning of the universe, at the point of the origin of life, and That's not something deism can explain, because a deistic creator confines its activity to the very beginning of the universe and doesn't act afterwards. So if we have evidence of intelligent design after the beginning, now we add that to the data set that we're trying to explain. Neither materialism, pantheism, or deism can explain all the evidence that's on the table. Only theism can. And that's kind of what St. Paul says. That's how far you can get with these kinds of design arguments. Now, but back to my other slide. Once you've provided a kind of foundation, a scientific, factual, evidential foundation for theism, you can build on that looking at, well, okay, if there's evidence for God, which God are we talking about? The God of the Bible? If so, well, is there evidence that bears on the question of the reliability of the Bible? And if so, then should we be looking at the Bible's claims about Christ? And so this is actually something we did here in Cambridge last year in a comprehensive apologetics course, looking at three big questions. Does God exist? Is the Bible reliable? Who is Jesus Christ? And you build the case step by step by step, not overstating your case at any given point along the way by trying to make nature tell us more about God than it can tell us. Okay, finally, one other advantage is that these design arguments, these science-based design arguments, help us split the horns of a kind of classical dilemma in religious epistemology. The dilemma where, on the one hand, we set an absurdly high standard of proof by claiming that we can prove the existence of God with absolute deductive certainty. And this was a mistake that was made in the Middle Ages quite commonly. Many theistic arguments were presented as proofs with the same degree of certainty as a proof in geometry. And when those arguments failed to meet those standards, the baby got thrown out with the bathwater, and then there was within the sort of Western philosophical world, people ended up adopting what is sometimes called fideism, the idea of faith and faith alone, that we take an irrational leap of faith. There's no evidential basis or rational basis for faith. By putting the ball down the middle of the fairway with these inference to the best explanation arguments, allow us to provide strong reasons for faith in God without trying to meet the unrealistic standard of proof. They do exactly what scientific arguments do. They provide evidence without absolute proof. And I think that's where we need to be epistemologically. And I think that helps us avoid these twin pitfalls of excessive rationalism on one side and an irrational or irrational approach to faith on the other.
Thank you. Let's go straight ahead. Thank you so much, Steve. And we'll hand over straight to Zachary, Research Fellow at the Sanger Institute here in Cambridge.
Okay, great. Thank you all for your attention. It's a real privilege to be here. It's a privilege to get to talk to you about this topic that I've been thinking about for a long time. I thank you to Steve for being up for having this discussion. My subtitle is Approaching Mainstream Biology Sympathetically as a Christian. So I'd like to give you a little window into my world as a research fellow in evolutionary biology and how, as a Christian, I approach this area of research. Some of the underlying questions for today, I think the big one is, how do we overall make best sense of biology? Does our faith in Jesus make a difference to how we see biology? Has evolutionary theory undermined a strong basis for belief in God? How should Christians approach mainstream biology? These are massive questions. I'm only going to be able to touch on them today. I'm not going to satisfy all of the questions that you might have, but hopefully this is an interesting introduction that might give you a window into my perspective. There's many things on which I actually agree with Dr. Meyer. And these are important, and these are not things which all Christians would agree on, but I think it's worth highlighting the points where we do agree, because we also have some fairly substantive disagreements. But we agree on the value of natural theology, that creation points to its creator. We agree that Earth has a deep history and deep time. It is approximately 4.5 billion years old. We agree that God has acted in creation. We agree that a good approach to comparing theories or even worldviews is something like inference the best explanation or Bayesian theory confirmation. We agree that design inferences are legitimate, though we may disagree on some of the details. I'll be offering an evolutionary design argument. This acknowledges that biology does appear designed. It acknowledges that evolution is claimed to undermine this, but it also accepts mainstream evolutionary biology and, in forming a design argument, proposes that design is evident in evolution's preconditions, processes, and/or products. And I think each of those three can be defended without going against mainstream biology. So to start with, I'll give a quick introduction to the context in which I see this topic, the context of historical processes in general. History is under the providence of God. Processes occurring within human history are very often messy. We see this, for instance, in the Old Testament. But God foreknew and ordained these processes, these events in history. Some of the processes follow laws or tendencies, such as the evolution of language. Studying such historical, law-like processes is not atheistic, or materialistic, or naturalistic. This is true for the evolution of language. I think it's also true for the study of the history of the mountains, geology, the study of the history of the earth, planetary sciences, the study of the history of the solar system and galaxies, astronomy, and the study of the history of the universe, cosmology. None of these is an atheistic discipline. God made all of these things, but we can study the historical processes. Could the same also be true for the evolution of species? The origin of species, the question of evolutionary biology. My proposal is that it's also true here. William Whewell, a great Cambridge polymath, a philosopher, theologian, physicist, whose name has been used for the recently established centre, said, but with regard to the material world, we can at least go so far as this. We can perceive that events are brought about not by insulated interpositions of divine power exerted in each particular case, but by the establishment of general laws. Very strategically and interestingly, Charles Darwin uses this quote at the start of The Origin of Species. He's saying that in the natural world, this was already accepted. The physical world, the astronomical world, God can use law-like processes to create. His argument, Darwin's argument, is that God may well also use such historical, law-like processes to create the origin of species. And this is the controversial topic. Unfortunately, this didn't really come up in Steve's talk today, which was focused on the origin of life, but I'm sure it will come up in the Q&A. So a quick aside, since my research is at the moment largely in protein evolution, I just wanted to give you a window into this field, to the kind of work which is being done, to give a sense of maybe why one might see this sympathetically. We can study the origin of genes, the evolution of proteins in various organisms or systems, including viruses. Viruses, like organisms, are members of hierarchical groups, species, genera, families, etc. Interestingly, on the left, we all accept, I think, something like this for the evolution of languages. We acknowledge that German is related to Dutch and English, and we can go broader within the Indo-European language family. Even things which look incredibly dissimilar, like Russian and English or Sanskrit and English, do share a common ancestor in history. This is true for languages, it's also true for viruses. And we can study the history of these things through evolutionary genetics. For instance, coronaviruses, a family of viruses that's caused our world some problems in recent years, is a diverse family with many different proteins, and we can study the history of these proteins in a way similar to that in which we study the history of languages. For many of these proteins, we can study their evolution. This is one of the projects that I've been involved in, studying some of the history of these proteins. The technical details are not worth going through here, but are very interesting if you're a molecular biologist. Just one example, there's a couple of genes in the virus, SARS-CoV-2, a coronavirus, which look very dissimilar to each other, as I'll show soon, at the sequence level, but actually turn out to be related. And we can tell this because of their extremely high structural similarity, and because we can trace their history by comparing across the related viruses, much as we can trace the history of languages by comparing across the phylogenetic tree of languages. So these two proteins initially look like they're completely dissimilar, but they turn out to be related. So this is on the left. If you do a sequence comparison, actually there's no statistically significant similarity at the sequence level comparing these two sequences, but through tracing the evolutionary history by comparing to other viruses, we can infer the history, and we can see that structurally they're highly similar. The same is also true for beta-lactamase and a protein called NILB, or a nilinase, which Steve is familiar with. Both of these are said in Steve's recent book to be part of the same protein fold, but they're highly dissimilar at the sequence level. I think the rational inference from studying comparing different proteins to each other is that these two proteins did share a common ancestor, and that protein evolution can cover a significant amount of sequence diversity. Many technical details there, but the main point, I guess, is that there is serious science in studying protein evolution, which goes against some of the claims of those who reject evolution. My conclusion is that proteins can change dramatically in both sequence and structure. Interestingly, perhaps, Richard Owen, who's often known as an opponent of evolutionary theory, the inaugural director of the Natural History Museum, in response to Darwin's theories, said the inductive demonstration of the nature and mode of operation of such secondary, continuously operative species-producing force will henceforth be the great aim of the philosophical naturalist. In other words, what processes lead to the origin of species? Whatever these are, and he wasn't a fan of all of Darwin's proposals, but whatever those processes are, is the rightful focus of the biologist henceforth. That was his message in response to Darwin. And this is the project in which I see myself engaged in as an evolutionary biologist, understanding the laws and processes which drive evolution. Much as geologists study the laws and processes that drive the history of mountains and rocks and the features of the earth, or astronomers study the laws and processes driving the history of the universe, biologists, I think, are quite right to study the laws and processes driving the history of life. What is this paradigm of evolution by design? How can we hold these things together? Aren't they inherently in opposition to each other? It's good to recap. How does the design argument work? Very basically, I think the core of a design argument is that the world includes a particular special feature, which is less probable given naturalism than theism. This doesn't need to be framed as a scientific hypothesis. It could be, or it could be framed as a philosophical inference. But there's something special about the world that makes more sense on theism than naturalism, or is more probable on theism than naturalism. That's a design argument. There's something special, all the possible worlds that might be out there, there's something special about this one. What about evolutionary mechanisms? Don't they undermine design arguments? I think a useful analogy is, if a car is produced by a fully automated factory, so you have a car, say on the left, this might have been created by hand. A car on the right that's produced by a fully automated factory, just machines. Is that second car still designed? My argument would be yes, because the machines, the factory that made the car is designed. So you can push design up a level and still retain both the appearance of design, the actuality of design, and the rationality of a design inference. Could life, likewise, still be special and recognizably designed, even though it were produced by the automated factory of evolution? My argument is yes, and this follows from Asa Gray, an early respondent to Darwin, who was a Christian and a key supporter of Darwin immediately after the origin of species. He was a professor of botany at Harvard and an Orthodox Christian. Theologically Orthodox, he was a Presbyterian. Okay, so what's the method for this design process that I'm talking about? Two options, at least, that I can think of. One is called front-loading. The other might be called providentialism. Front-loading of evolution has been proposed not just by theistic evolutionists, as you might hear in some contexts, but by design theorists like Michael Behe and William Dembski. On this account, the design is front-loaded into the initial conditions of evolution or the very processes of evolution or both, and it could be inferred from fine-tuning of the preconditions or fine-tuning of the initial conditions or the processes. The second is a collection of ideas that I term providentialism. This would seek design in special events in evolutionary history. Some events, such as the formation of eukaryotes, cells that have a true nucleus, appear to have required an improbable coincidence of factors. But I would say the evidence that they did have an evolutionary history still remains. So this was an interesting, improbable event, but there's still good evidence that it has an evolutionary history. Such fortuitous events could be pointers to divine providence. I have here a picture of the formation of the moon as another such example, something which on standard models is proposed to be incredibly improbable, but I would say is an indication of God's providence in the creation of the Earth-Moon system, which is so important for life. Many things we could talk about here, but just a quick introduction that there are methods by which this design might be implemented. So how, more specifically, could evolution show evidence of design? I think there's multiple good candidates for this. This also gets a bit technical, but that's just the nature of molecular biology. So I think there's multiple good candidates for explanatory remainder, that if you accept the standard picture of evolution, there's still some things that seem to remain unexplained in a philosophical sense for a complete, comprehensive, satisfying explanation. So firstly, the world must be hospitable, not just to the existence of life, as held in the standard fine-tuning argument, but the evolution of complex life. The first cell needs to be such that it is evolvable. You need to not just have a first cell, but have the kind of first cell which is able to evolve into other things. There may be improbable transformative events within evolutionary history that aren't fully explained in a fully comprehensive sense because they remain improbable. Something like eukaryogenesis is a promising example of this. Mutations need to be able to reach interesting phenotypes. The whole space that mutations are exploring needs to be arranged in such a way that is conducive to evolution. If there are underlying laws of biology, why are they so conducive to evolution? Why are these laws fruitful for producing evolutionary complexity? Fitness landscapes, so the way that natural selection works, need to be approximately smooth and continuous, as seen in the analogy given by Richard Dawkins of Mount Improbable. There needs to be a smooth pathway up the mountain. Let's say that this is true, that evolution has actually happened. Let's say we're also driven by natural selection, which is an open question. That would require that there are these pathways, and the fact that there are these pathways is something that calls out for an explanation in my mind. So the mere fact of saying that there is such a pathway is, I think, satisfying biologically and is a good biological theory, but still leaves open the philosophical question of why do we live in a world which is able to evolve in this way? I'll go through some of these details just very quickly, and people will be welcome to see the slides at the end if they want to follow up the details. One really nice example of a hospitable world is the example of photochemistry. So this was developed by various people, including Nobel Prize winner George Wald, who was not a theist, but towards the end of his life, I believe, became more sympathetic to something like theism as a result of his explorations in this kind of area. So it turns out that for photochemistry to work, for light from the sun to do anything useful chemically, requires there to be a really amazing coincidence between the kind of energy given by the sun or other stars and the amount of energy required for chemical reactions. And this is something which is discussed in various scientific sources. But this, given the huge range of possible wavelengths for light, this is a really interesting coincidence between the amount of energy found in solar light and the amount of energy required for either photochemistry or also for vision, which have both been hugely important in evolutionary history. George Wald himself said it is mind that has composed a physical universe that breeds life. This is a remarkable shift for someone who was strongly atheistic earlier on. This idea that mutations can reach interesting phenotypes. I'm not going to go through each of these because this is quite technical, but there's a wealth of recent scientific work showing that evolution is remarkably fruitful and the underlying structures of evolution facilitate this fruitfulness. And this is something that I'm very actively working on. One of the many interesting things is that every single biological organism contains a history of life in its genome. And this is a remarkable fact, that each organism contains some core genes that are shared across all of life, and this allows us to trace back the history of life. This is a remarkable gift to biological science. It enables the use of animals in medical research. It enables us to understand evolutionary history. Is evolution shaped by some kind of underlying laws? The fact that we see the same forms appearing again and again is a hint towards this. Examples on the left is the bacterioflagellum, well known in intelligent design literature, and the archaeoflagellum, or archaelon, which both have converged on a remarkably similar form. I think there's an evolutionary history to this, but the fact they have converged on the same form, I think is a pointer to these underlying laws. And we see the same in other kinds of convergences, which are more famous. My friend Dr. Rope Koyonen says the more laws of form explain evolution, the more natural selection starts to look merely like a search engine, discovering forms, or like an architect building ready-made blueprints. And I think these underlying blueprints of life are designed and are a pointer to design. One of my concluding points, bringing this towards an end, is I think actually we all need to accept something like evolution by design. Dr. Douglas Axe, a colleague of Stephen, says, I believe in his book Undeniable, the giant panda is yet another example of something perfect, something that is exactly as it should be. So he looks at a modern species, the interesting, clumsy, amazing giant panda, and says that's perfect. That's something that God must have designed. But actually, most intelligent design theorists, most creationists, whether young Earth or old Earth, accept that animals are typically related within at least the level of the genus. The panda is related to other organisms. We see this in the fossil record. The panda is related to other bears. So if the panda is indeed related, as accepted by many intelligent design theorists, including Michael Behe and most young Earth creationists, then the panda has evolutionary cousins, that it is related to other things. And if it is designed, it was designed via evolution. So as soon as you accept that there are groups of species that are related, and if you think those species still show evidence of design, you need to accept something like an evolution by design argument. Okay, in summary, I propose the evolution by design paradigm as a Christian framework for biology. I suggest the wisdom of God is manifest in the orderly unfolding of both galaxies and life. The preconditions, processes, and products of evolution are all pointers to God's action. And because God acted freely in creation, one of the key tenets of the scientific revolution, we should approach open on the methods which God used in this matter. I suggest that life's diversity points to its creator with or without evolution. I'd like to end with a quote from Asa Gray, a friend of Darwin. Faith in order, which is the basis of science, cannot reasonably be separated from faith in an ordainer, which is the basis of religion. Some follow-up information, a QR code for the slides if you'd like to follow up. I look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you both very much. So how are we going to do this Q&A? What I'd like to begin with is to explore with you both the area of agreement, which is converging on design arguments being helpful, being possible, around the theme of inference to the best explanation. And I wonder if you could both comment on, you guys are agreeing that that's a helpful way to go. As Zachary pointed to the fact that some, even Christians who are in this space, are not comfortable with design arguments. I wonder if you could summarize why there might be an objection to that sort of an approach and just help us understand why both of you are so comfortable with that?
Maybe
Steve first.
There are some theological objections to design arguments that there's a whole class of objections called reformed objections to natural theology. And someone cornered me yesterday saying that there's also a whole tradition of reformed support for natural theology, but the reformed objections run along the lines of the argument is that people making design arguments are not taking into adequate account the fallenness of the human intellect, and that therefore, since the mind is darkened without the illumination of the Holy Spirit, we can't really see what nature is actually pointing to. So that's one. An interesting response. Alvin Plantinga has written a very reformed theological philosopher has written a number of good responses to that. One is that, well, just because we're not saying that these design arguments are necessary to coming to faith, they're not sufficient to come to faith. Saving faith doesn't come just by recognizing that there's a designer, but it doesn't imply that they may not be helpful. And so he says it's a little bit like maybe this is my line, I can't remember. It's a little bit like the whole thing about infant baptism. Not only have I seen it, not only do I believe it, but I've seen it done, And we've seen many scientists who have come to faith where the first step in that was recognizing the design of the cosmos. And some of the people that first influenced me were great cosmologist Alan Sandage and an origin of life researcher, Dean Kenyon, both of whom had stories of that sort, where they had come to faith, first having a scientific conversion away from materialism to some sort of proto-theism, and then eventually having a Christian conversion. So I think these arguments, just experientially, we know they can be used. With my Reformed colleagues, I sometimes would argue that design arguments could be an occasion of grace for some. The Holy Spirit can use those as much as anything else.
Do you want to comment as well, Zachary?
No,
Yeah.
I'm fine with this.
My second and final question before opening it up, in the interests of clarification, am I right in thinking that you're both making design arguments? Zachary's is then remaining at a higher level in terms of the specification of the overall system, and that Steve's is, in addition, saying that there are specific moments where divine action was additionally detected, other than just setting up the system. So I wonder if you could just clarify between yourselves if that's the point where your difference is, because it seems to me that Steve might well agree at the higher level, but is just adding an extra layer to the picture.
Yeah, you want to go first or second? Or?
Sure. Well, I would say biology points to its designer, but I say it also shows clear evidence of common descent. And I think that some of the processes that have been involved in this common ancestry or common descent also show evidence of design. So I'm happy to see design in the preconditions, processes, and products of evolution. Mm-hmm. So not just in the big picture, but also in some of the details.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Steve, what's the additional
I appreciated Zachary's talk because it opens up the question, an important question of what is the locus of design? Where are we seeing the evidence for the activity of the designing mind or intelligence of the creator most clearly? I like the illustration of the motor car. There are processes. Once all of the parts of the car are configured in a very particular way, which would require, by the way, a huge input of information, where we say this, not that, here, not there. Anytime you're electing one option and excluding others, you're imparting a bit of information. So the configuring of that motor car engine is going to require a lot of information up front. Then you're going to see regular patterns or processes ensue. The question is that input of initial information that makes those regularities possible all present at the origin of the universe, or at the origin of the first cell, or maybe in the first animal body plans, or further up the biological hierarchy? And I think those are open questions. My particular sympathies are with a model of divine action that sees God's hands as untied. I think we live in a time when there are very powerful naturalistic sensibilities, and so in interacting with our naturalistic colleagues, if we're going to affirm a design argument, we might want to make as few claims about divine action as possible. But when I look at the fossil record, I wrote an article with I wrote a whole book about the origin of animal body plans, about the Cambrian explosion. It's a massive increase in biological form and structure. It appears very discontinuously in the fossil record. We don't see evidence of the ancestral precursors that led to these major animal groups. I'd be inclined to see evidence of design at that point. I wrote an article with our late colleague Gunter Beckley. It turns out that he's a very fine paleontologist, and the Cambrian explosion is by no means the only such massive emergence of new form, and therefore input of new information into the biosphere. So I think probably where Zach and I disagree would be about whether or not the information necessary to build all the forms of life is front-end loaded in something like the first cell, or whether there are subsequent infusions of information and form along the way.
So just to clarify that, I also gave the option of providentialism, that there is providential guiding that tips evolution in one direction or the other. So I think both are compatible.
Yeah,
with
I like that.
evolutionary
That's an
theory.
interesting idea.
And a lot of theistic evolutionists would hold something like providentialism, I think, if you talk to them. I would disagree on some of the science around, say, the Cambrian explosion. It's not really clear to me how much information is required. There's some numbers that are used that I just disagree on for empirical reasons, which are very interesting, but this is not the time for them.
Yeah. And theologically speaking, you both are saying the universe had a beginning through divine action and that Jesus rose from the dead by divine action. So we've got that wider agreement too. Good, so let's open up for questions. Let's keep it to short questions, not comments, if that's possible, and keeping it, if possible, ordered towards apologetics. Thanks, Phil. There's a mic coming.
Yeah, thank you both. Zachary, I'm really interested in, and Stephen, you mentioned kind of some of the I guess objections you might have got from colleagues in the field. Zachary, as you've, I guess, like tried some of these, posited some of these ideas with those around you, what kind of pushback do you get from colleagues who you're working alongside to that idea of, okay, at the kind of process level?
So I have presented this view in a talk hosted by my Christian group at my institute and to various other colleagues, and I really haven't got that much pushback. It's not that I've explored it in a lot of detail with people, but I think there's not too much that can be said for those who are not really experts in the area. There's not many people who are really experts in evolutionary theory who are as deep into the details as those of us who really research it. I think, of course, there's an aversion to seeing any kind of design, but the basic point that there is some explanatory remainder in mainstream evolutionary theory, I think that, I'm yet to kind of get strong pushback, so we'll see what happens in the next few years.
Thank you. We have a question on the front.
Thank you both. I actually teach young kids at home, and I feel like at that age they need concrete facts. And when I'm trying to teach things in science, it's either a naturalistic view that you end up seeing, or you have these Christian worldviews. And so, but when they go on to college, I know that they're going to end up hearing these opposite or opposing ideas. And I don't necessarily want it to turn into relativism at that point where your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth. So can you end up helping to argue for a better approach about how to teach concrete facts to young kids?
Oh, I have a lot to say about that. Yeah, I think it's very important. Well, some of this is age specific, right? But by the time you get to the high school age, our kids went through a classical Christian academy that used the Dorothy L. Sayers, different stages of learning. But by the time you get to high school, when students are wanting to argue, you get to what they call the rhetoric stage. It's really important to teach competing views. And we call it teaching the controversies. So a really good education on biology would teach the standard neo-Darwinian view, the new theories of evolution that are secular or materialistic, a view like Zachary's, and a view like mine, and explain the range of views, and let students begin to grapple with those different views around a common agreed set of facts. So it's I think very important not to shelter students from the different perspectives, whether it's in history or politics or biology that are out there, so that when they get to the university, they don't feel like they're suddenly encountering forbidden fruit and feel like they've been unprepared for that.
Something I'd say is I think one of the key distinctions is to distinguish between not to think that a scientific explanation necessarily competes with a theistic explanation. So I would say we often talk about laws of nature, or often these are described as naturalistic. I think they're equally well described as God's laws, which he uses to govern the universe. So when Jesus says that God feeds the birds of the air, he uses natural processes in doing that. So the study of science is studying the created world, which God has made. And I think it's really important for children and those heading into university to not be afraid of natural processes as if they were in opposition to God's governance or God's action in the world. That's setting people up to fail, I think. So for me, it's really important that we're open to exploring what science has to say about the natural processes. And these are God's laws, so we can be very happy to explore what they are.
Yeah, I piggyback on that because I think it highlights an important point of agreement and disagreement. In my book on the return of the God hypothesis, I make the same point that Zachary's making, that the early founders of modern science, in formulating formulating mathematical descriptions of law-like processes or regularities, believed that they were describing modes of divine action, that God had, and they called that the ordinary power of God, the potentia ordinata. But they were also aware that God acted in special, more discrete ways, more in the manner of an agent at specific points in time. This would be more like the kind of thing that Zach was talking about providential twisting or turnings in history. But one point of, I think, disagreement is the idea that the law-like processes can generate information. When we describe something with a law, we usually describe it if there's a pattern of regularity: sun up, sun down, I drop the ball, it falls, I drop the ball, it falls, I drop the ball, it falls. That type of regularity in the information sciences is characterized as redundancy. You get the same thing happening over and over and over again. If you want to express a complex idea or convey a complex set of instructions, you can't say the same thing over and over and over again. You'll end up with a mantra, not a message. So those processes in nature that can be described in a law-like way with differential equations or with an algorithm are not the same types of things that generate information. If you look at any informational sequence, you have the characters are highly variable, but they're specifically arranged to achieve a function. So there's a difference between what we call specified complexity and simple order. And so oftentimes there is an appeal to laws as the explanation for the new information that's needed to build new organisms, new types of new forms of life. But I don't think that laws can generate the kinds of information or that can generate information that's necessary to do that. You need something else. You need an input, a more specific input from an agent. And in the history of Western philosophy and thought, there was this idea of the ordinary power of God, but also the fiat power of God, that God acted more discreetly as an agent. So I see both powers at work, and I agree with Zach, we should not teach students that laws are contrary to God. They're not naturalistic. They're a mode of his action. They're expressing they express a means by which he acts in the world, but it may be that he acts in other ways too that are, in some cases, more discernible.
If I can quickly
respond
to this. So I think this is interesting, and so I think we disagree empirically on how much information is required for things like proteins. That's an empirical disagreement. We also somewhat disagree on the nature of laws, which gets somewhat technical. But so I think laws are freely chosen from many different possibilities. So there is, I think, quite a bit of information encoded in laws. I think often laws are conflated with necessity, but laws are not logically necessary. There's a difference between physical necessity and logical necessity, which I think is important here. I think God has chosen this particular world with its laws, And as I see it, the laws of biophysics encode a lot about the basics of the mapping between sequence and structure in proteins. But this gets highly technical and be interesting to talk more with Steve.
Well, we're gonna get a lunch, so that's good. Yeah.
We have time for one more question, but I know that these guys are happy to hang around. How should we decide? I think you were first, and thank you.
Thanks. I was wondering if you could tell me what your views are about mutation, because I think according to the typical view of natural selection, mutations play an important role in that process. And, questions in my mind is, are mutations adding new information? Are they random? And since most are harmful, what does that mean about God if God is causing mutations?
Do you want to start?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Mutation. So, the standard evolutionary theory is a combination of mutation and natural selection. Recent developments in evolutionary theory do emphasize that mutations are not random and that they have a particular distribution which does bias evolution in a certain way. It is true that mutations are largely deleterious, but not true that they're all deleterious. Many are neutral, and some are positive under some circumstances. So there is a distribution of fitness effects of mutation, and it's not all on the negative side. So long as there's some mutations that are neutral, that allows evolution to explore, that allows the exploration of sequence space. And I think biology is incredibly well set up, very robust, in a way that does facilitate this exploration. And so there's a whole literature on evolvability, and this is tied in with this idea of how mutations work and how they lead to new phenotypes. So one of the books I suggested but didn't verbally say was a really brilliant book by Andreas Wagner, who's a secular evolutionary biologist who recognizes that there are some underlying principles in biology whereby the evolutionary explanation via mutation can explore new phenotypes, new organismal form, new organismal features. So that book is Arrival of the Fittest by Andreas Wagner. So if you're interested in mutation, I highly recommend that book.
Yeah, there's just a lot to say about this topic, but maybe a story will help since we're getting near the end, are we?
Yeah.
Okay.
Final answer.
There's a wonderful evolutionary biologist at the University of Chicago named James Shapiro. He was a prime mover in the 2016 conference at the Royal Society, which was convened by a group of evolutionary biologists who sometimes called themselves Third Way. They're not neo-Darwinian, and they would be very loath to affirm anything like intelligent design, but they're recognizing the need for a new theory of evolution. And Shapiro's theory he calls natural genetic engineering, and it's based in part on what Zach was just describing, that many of the mutations that are actually observed now are not random at all. They seem to be biased towards certain types of outcomes, that what's going on in the underlying level is there's something like an if-then subroutine where the organism encounters a particular environmental change, and then that triggers a change in the expression of the genome, or or an active mutational change in a hotspot on the genome. And we had a seminar with Shapiro and my colleagues Paul Nelson and Michael Behe several years ago at one of the universities in the Chicago area. And apparently, I wasn't at the seminar, but apparently Shapiro out Behe in depicting the incredible complexity. And he talked about these underlying algorithms, that these the organism was under algorithmic control. That if there was a certain trigger, it would, or change the trigger, a certain type of response. And so my colleague Paul Nelson, who did his PhD at Chicago, went and met with Jim afterwards and said, "Man, that was a fascinating talk." But in the discussion, Shapiro, having out Behe, said, "But I can't make any sense of this idea of intelligent design of yours." So Paul went and followed up, and they got in a conversation. He said, "Well, Jim, you're talking about this pre-programmed adaptive capacity in the organism that allows it to respond to environmental changes, and And he said, yeah, the mutations are not random. And Nelson says, yeah, that's right, we agree. He says, but where did the pre-programming come from? And Shapiro apparently said, I hardly ever think about that. And Paul said, that's what we're thinking about. So that's a locus of design, okay? Where does that algorithmic control that makes, in the case of whatever organism that they were talking about, a certain amount of evolutionary change possible. The difference between Zach and me, probably in our perspectives, is whether there is pre-programmed adaptive capacity in one single organism that allows the unfolding of the entire history of life and all the organisms that have arisen since then, or whether there have been subsequent infusions of information in form that would, again, have some of their own pre-programmed adaptive capacity. So whether you have one big envelope of biological change, or whether there are many envelopes along the way in the history of life. And I think that's just a really fun, open question, and I hope he and I we're going to try to talk more about it. So this is a good discussion.
Thank you both so much. We've been really privileged to hear you interact, to hear your thoughts. I've been very clarifying for myself, so thank you very much. Let's give them a round of applause.